I hope you're holding up, wherever you are. My name's Daniel, and today I want to share a story that still stings every time I think about it. It's from a man named Caleb, 27, who lived in a small lakeside town in Oregon. Caleb thought he was preparing for a future with the woman he loved. Instead, he found himself watching everything he trusted collapse in the most unimaginable way. 4 years ago, Caleb lost his mother to ovarian cancer. Since then, he tried to keep some kind of connection with his father, Leonard, who was 58 and lived alone in a weathered house not far from the shoreline. Caleb and his fiancée, Sienna, also 27, would visit Leonard often for dinner. At first, it felt like the right thing to do, keeping family close, especially with so few of them left. But something changed recently. Leonard had been smiling more, talking with an ease that hadn't been there in years. Caleb thought maybe he was starting to heal. He was wrong. One rainy evening in March, Leonard invited them over for dinner, like he had so many times before. But after the dishes were cleared and the coffee poured, Leonard looked at his son with a strange tension in his eyes and said, "We need to talk." That was when the truth unraveled. Leonard and Sienna had been in a sexual relationship for over 3 months. Caleb's heart stopped in his chest, and he struggled to even process what he was hearing. In a moment of desperation, maybe to make it feel less real, he asked them how many times. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened. He knew, even as he asked, that he didn't want the answer. They hesitated, as if silence would soften the betrayal. It didn't. Caleb didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stood up, looked at his father and the woman he was supposed to marry, and said coldly, "If you want her, you can have her. I'm done with both of you." He turned to Sienna and asked for the keys to their shared apartment. Her hands shook as she tried to remove them from her keychain, tears pouring down her face. When she fumbled, Caleb took them off for her, handed her the rest of her keys, and told her he'd pack her things. She could come by and get them when he was done. She didn't come herself. Her mother did. When her mom arrived, she looked ashamed, like the weight of her daughter's betrayal rested on her shoulders too. She told Caleb she'd heard everything, that she was deeply sorry, and that she hoped he'd make it through. But Caleb wasn't sure how. For the next week, he ignored every call and message from both Sienna and Leonard. Then, without warning, 2 officers showed up at his apartment door. Leonard had called the police, claiming he was worried Caleb might harm himself. That was almost laughable. Caleb assured them he was not suicidal. He explained what had happened, and their faces shifted to a mix of pity and disgust. They apologized for bothering him, but Caleb still felt humiliated, not because of what he'd done, but because of what had been done to him. Leonard wanted to talk. He kept reaching out, as if a few messages could undo months of deceit. Caleb didn't know what to do. He had no siblings, no extended family, just ghosts and silence. Sienna had moved back in with her parents, but was still talking to Leonard. That much was clear from his messages. Leonard insisted she was worried about Caleb and that Caleb was being cruel for not forgiving her. Cruel? He called Caleb heartless for cutting her off, like he hadn't ripped his son's world apart. Caleb couldn't understand how they saw themselves as the victims in all of this. He had ended it, made that abundantly clear. Yet here was his own father trying to stitch something back together with words that meant nothing. The truth was, Caleb didn't want their apologies. He wanted them gone. There was no coming back from betrayal like this. You can't rebuild trust with the people who destroyed it. A father is supposed to protect you. A fiancé is supposed to stand beside you. Instead, they chose each other and left him standing in the wreckage. In his grief, Caleb threw himself into routine: the gym, work, sleep, anything to feel a little less hollow. But no matter what he did, their absence echoed in every quiet moment. He wasn't sure what he hated more, their betrayal or the fact that part of him still missed the people they used to be. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want closure. He just wanted peace. But peace felt miles away. And now, Leonard, the man who once held Caleb as a boy after nightmares, was the very source of his worst one. How do you recover when the person you trusted most becomes the one who breaks you? Caleb didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the life he thought he was building was gone. And somehow he'd have to start over, with nothing but the hurt they left behind. You can't rebuild something when the foundation is gone. Caleb knew that. Even if Leonard begged for forgiveness, even if Sienna swore she'd changed, there was no version of the future where trust would magically return. What would happen next? Bring someone new into his life only to wonder if his own father might betray him again? There was no room left for hope in a relationship that had already drowned. People online had plenty of advice. One comment stuck with him. Someone said he should send a message to Leonard, warning him not to reach out again. That if he didn't stop, Caleb might have to seek legal protection. It was a thought that chilled him. The idea of filing a restraining order against his own father? But that's where this path had led. Another person suggested Caleb remind Leonard of the kind of woman his late mother was, and that she would never, ever have forgiven him for what he'd done. Caleb didn't need to hear that to know it was true. His mother had always believed in family, in loyalty. She would have been broken by this betrayal. Others reminded Caleb that the shame didn't belong to him. The officers who had come to his door hadn't pitied him. They had pitied the man who forced his own son to recount such a horror. No decent person would blame Caleb for walking away. No decent person could hear that story and think he owed either of them anything. One particularly cutting comment summed it up like this: "Your father and your ex-fiancé didn't worry about your well-being when they were sneaking around. Why would they start now? Their sudden concern isn't about you. It's about damage control. It's about keeping up appearances. They want to clean the mess not because they care, but because they're embarrassed it's all come to light." Caleb wished it weren't true, but it was. So he posted an update. He hadn't expected the overwhelming flood of support after his first post. Thousands of strangers had reached out, and oddly, some of them felt more like family than the people he'd grown up with. He let them know he was doing okay, sleeping better, eating again, trying to breathe. He didn't need to expose them publicly. Sienna had taken care of that herself. Apparently, she'd confided in her best friend, hoping for comfort. What she got instead was fury. Her best friend cut her off immediately, and word spread quickly. People who once saw her as the sweet, loyal partner were now asking if she had made moves on their fathers too. Caleb hadn't even considered the idea of revenge. But the way her world fell apart without him lifting a finger, it almost felt like justice. She still believed Caleb would forgive her, that he'd come back. But Caleb could see through that delusion. Sienna wasn't holding on to love. She was grasping at the last piece of her old life that hadn't crumbled yet. He didn't want revenge. He wanted closure. He wanted quiet. Still, he called her parents, told them not to abandon her, no matter how angry they were. He didn't want her spiraling, doing something she couldn't take back. Despite everything, he didn't want her hurt. It was the last mercy he had to give. The only reason Caleb met Leonard in person again was to collect a few things from the house. His mother's belongings, what was left of her. He brought a friend with him, not out of fear, but to keep himself grounded, just in case rage took over. He was honest with himself about that possibility. Leonard said nothing when they met. No small talk, no fatherly warmth. Caleb noticed his friend hovering close, ready to intervene if things went south. But there was no explosion, only silence and cold eyes. Once he gathered his mother's wedding ring, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the engagement ring he had once given Sienna. He held it out to Leonard. "You can have this," he said flatly. "I don't need it anymore." Leonard didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He just stared at it, this symbol of everything he had shattered, and took it. Caleb watched him in that moment and saw something flicker in his father's expression. Regret, maybe, or just the weight of finally understanding what he had destroyed. Before he left, Caleb gave one final message. "Stop telling her I might forgive her," he said. "You're only confusing her. Let her accept it's over." Leonard nodded, mumbling something about staying out of it from now on. Caleb didn't care either way. The bridge was already ashes. He walked out the front door and didn't look back. Caleb climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and just sat there for a while, hands gripping the wheel, forehead leaning against it. The silence wrapped around him like a blanket laced with ash. Then he started the engine and drove away. There was no triumph, no relief, just the quiet echo of finality. Later that evening, sitting alone in his apartment with the rain tapping against the windows, he thought about the ring. Maybe it was petty to give it back to Leonard, but he didn't care. Let his father figure out what to do with it now. Wear it himself, or slide it onto Sienna's finger. If Leonard wanted her that badly, he could have the full package, broken vows and all. Caleb was done carrying pieces of a life that no longer existed. He logged back into the forum where he'd first shared his story and typed a brief update. The response had overwhelmed him. Thousands of strangers sent support, advice, and pieces of themselves. It made him feel less alone, less like the world was against him. He told them he was doing okay, or at least trying to be. Sleeping more soundly, getting out of bed without that crushing weight on his chest, and, surprisingly, finding comfort in places he hadn't expected. Sienna had already made sure the truth got out. Caleb didn't have to tell anyone. Her own carelessness did the job for him. She confided in her best friend, thinking she'd find understanding. Instead, her friend unloaded on her with a fury Caleb hadn't even summoned himself. That anger spread quickly. Most of the people who once stood beside Sienna now saw her clearly, and they turned away. Some even messaged Caleb, offering apologies for ever believing in the person she pretended to be. One of them, her former best friend, called Caleb. They talked for over an hour. She didn't try to excuse anything, she just listened. She told her she'd been betrayed once too, but even she couldn't fathom the level of betrayal he'd endured. They kept in touch. Not romantically, just two people clinging to something honest after being dragged through something cruel. Their connection became a quiet refuge in the chaos. Sienna, according to that same friend, still believed there was a path back to Caleb, that somehow he'd forgive her. That illusion gave her something to cling to. But Caleb had moved on in every way that mattered. He even reached out to her parents, not out of pity, but because he didn't want them to abandon her completely. He knew what loneliness felt like, and despite everything, he didn't want her to do something irreversible. Then there was Leonard. Caleb hadn't planned to see his father again, but he needed to retrieve some of his mother's keepsakes from the house, photographs, letters, and her wedding ring. So he went, taking a friend with him just in case. His grief boiled over into something physical. Leonard didn't say much. He looked smaller than Caleb remembered, somehow older, diminished. Caleb didn't want his words, just his silence and his cooperation. After collecting what he needed, Caleb handed Leonard a small black box. Inside was the engagement ring meant for Sienna. "You can have this," he said, his voice dry. Leonard didn't argue, just looked at it like it was a loaded gun, a symbol of everything he'd destroyed. Caleb didn't stay to talk. He didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been buried under months of silence and betrayal. Before leaving, Caleb left one last request. Stop telling her there's hope. You're messing with her head. Let her go. Leonard nodded weakly. Caleb walked out without waiting for a promise. And that was the last time he saw him. In his final update, Caleb explained he was okay. Still scarred, still shaken, but surviving. Leonard and Sienna hadn't contacted him since. He had moments where anger bubbled to the surface, and nights when the loneliness gnawed at his ribs. But there were also new memories, new people, new spaces untouched by the past. He and Sienna's former best friend, her name was Ivy, had decided to take a short trip together. Nothing romantic, just a reset, a reminder that the world hadn't ended, even if it felt like it had. As predicted, Leonard and Sienna were seen together again, around town, in quiet cafes. Caleb wasn't surprised. They'd lost most of their social circle. People didn't look at them the same anymore. Maybe they had each other. Maybe that was punishment enough. Caleb told his friends they didn't have to pick sides. If anyone wanted to talk to Sienna, that was their choice. He didn't want to be the kind of man who controlled others through his pain. He had enough of that from his father. Therapy was helping. He still had bad days, but they came less frequently. He'd spent an entire weekend scrubbing his apartment, washing the scent of Sienna's perfume from the walls, the pillows, the air. He bought a new bed, a new couch, rearranged the furniture. It was the same apartment, but it felt different now, clean, his. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't closure, it was a beginning. When Caleb reached his car, he barely had time to sit before he heard footsteps crunching across the gravel behind him. Ivy, Sienna's former best friend, the only person who'd really been there lately, caught up, trying to explain. "He wasn't laughing at you," she said softly, clearly trying to make sense of the chaos. "He just didn't know what to say." But Caleb had heard the laughter, and it hadn't sounded like confusion. It had sounded like dismissal, the kind that sticks to your ribs. "It's just a book," she said, he told her. "Why are you acting like this? It was $20. But to Caleb, it had never just been a book. It was a birthday gift from someone who used to mean something, handed over during a moment that once felt warm. He was going to hold on to that book, not just read it, but protect it. Keep it as a symbol of something still gentle in a world that had roughened around the edges. But now, it was gone, chewed to ruin. He had tried to leave quietly, to process alone. But Ivy's mother had come outside too, folding her arms with that same exasperated tone Leonard used to have when Caleb cried as a boy. "Don't you think you're being a little dramatic?" Maybe he was. Maybe grief always looks like drama to people who haven't been hollowed out. Caleb didn't have much, not anymore. And no, he wasn't materialistic. But when your life falls apart and your trust is shattered, sometimes you need small, tangible things to hold on to. A book, a ring, a letter in your mother's handwriting. Something that doesn't betray you when you close your eyes. The dog had destroyed other things before. A backpack, a phone charger, even Caleb's old headphones the last time he visited. But he had let it go, told himself it wasn't worth a fight. But this book was different. It was the final thread. And when it snapped, something in Caleb did too. He later edited his post, clarifying what had really happened. No, he hadn't left the book on the couch or a low shelf. He had placed it on top of a high counter, where he always put his things now, ever since the wallet incident. It wasn't like he hadn't tried to protect it. He didn't leave it in his car because, in Portland, car break-ins were as common as rain. His last vehicle had been shattered into twice in 6 months. He thought inside the house was safer. He also explained something else. Books weren't just paper to him. They were escape. They had been there when nothing else had. When he was 16 and coming home to a quiet house with a mother dying in the bedroom down the hall, when his friends were too afraid to talk about grief and he had no one else to listen, books carried him through thoughts he didn't like admitting he'd had, dark, hopeless ones. They gave him worlds where fathers didn't sleep with your fiancé and where people didn't laugh when you cried. So yeah, it wasn't just a book. Caleb knew he was more sensitive than most. He'd been told that his whole life. He was in therapy, working through it. But being sensitive didn't mean being wrong. And when he saw Sienna's mother shrug, like none of it mattered, that wound cut deep. Some people online got it. Bailey the nerd said he had every right to be upset, that the dog should have been trained, and that his ex's family should have at least offered to replace the book. Caleb hadn't asked for money. He'd just wanted someone to say, "I'm sorry," but no one had. Others were harsher. They asked why he kept leaving things where the dog could get them, as if he'd forgotten the danger, as if he hadn't already adjusted. They didn't understand that he'd tried. He really had. But when people and pets show you they don't care, no amount of caution can shield you completely. One reply called the whole thing senseless. Why take the book inside at all? Why not leave it in the glove box? Caleb knew now that he probably should have, but he hadn't thought he needed to be on constant alert in what was supposed to be a safe space. That's the trick with trauma. It doesn't make you wise, just wary and tired. Righteous Vengeance wrote that his ex's parents should have paid for everything their dog had destroyed. Not just the book, but all the moments and meaning behind it. Someone else said that Caleb's boyfriend had no business laughing, that at the very least he should have offered to buy another copy, said he'd fix it, held him instead of mocking the crack in his voice. Other comments blamed Caleb too, said he should have known better, should have been smarter. But those people had never watched the last gift from someone they loved be torn to pieces like it was nothing. They didn't know what it meant to find comfort in something so small, only to lose it again and again. So Caleb closed the app, deleted the notifications, and sat in silence. Maybe it really was just a book. But to him, it had been the last bit of kindness he was still trying to believe in. Some comments online pulled no punches. One said Caleb should have known better than to leave the book in the house again, especially around a dog that had already destroyed so much. You can't expect different results when you keep walking into the same fire, someone wrote. Another said everyone was at fault. Sienna's parents for never training their dog, Sienna for laughing, and Caleb, just a little, for still hoping things would be different. It stung. But maybe there was truth buried in the harshness. One reply stood out more than the rest. "You need to leave him," it said. "If he can't even validate your pain over something that meant so much to you, what's he going to do when life gets harder? You deserve empathy, not mockery." Caleb had considered that, but things weren't that simple. In an update, he tried to explain the whole story. He said he didn't expect so many responses. He'd assumed he'd write it out, maybe get a few comments, then delete the whole thing and move on. But it blew up, and so did his emotions. He shared that he still cared for Sienna and her family, that they weren't cruel people, just limited. Sienna had supported him when he was unemployed, made sure he ate, reminded him to rest when the days felt too long. Her laughter hadn't come from cruelty, her mother said. It was confusion, discomfort, not knowing what to say. That didn't make it easier, but it made it clearer. Caleb talked to both of them, gave them his side, told them what the book meant. Sienna's mother apologized for the misunderstanding. Sienna herself apologized too. They didn't offer to replace the book, but Caleb said he wouldn't ask. He wasn't someone who liked asking for anything, not even comfort. They hugged. It didn't fix anything, but it quieted the noise a little. Caleb said he was going to start storing his things in Sienna's closet from now on. Her mom admitted she cried sometimes when the dog destroyed her own belongings, that this wasn't new, just a problem they hadn't solved. Caleb wasn't angry anymore, just tired of being misunderstood, tired of feeling like his sadness was an inconvenience. He ended the post saying he knew he was emotional, that he was trying to be better, that he'd keep working on being patient. But something inside him still ached. This story touches on something many people face today, the pain of feeling invisible in your own relationship. Caleb's heartbreak over a ruined book might seem small to some, but it symbolizes a larger issue, the invalidation of emotional needs. In modern relationships, it's critical to recognize that small hurts often stem from bigger wounds. Emotional safety is just as important as physical safety. If you're in a relationship where your feelings are routinely dismissed, take it seriously. Your emotions matter. You don't need to justify why something hurt you. It's enough that it did. Practice boundaries. Speak up calmly and clearly when something crosses a line. If you're met with mockery or indifference, it might be time to re-evaluate that connection. Seek support from people who listen, whether that's friends, a therapist, or even a stranger online who says, "I see you." Healing isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing what you'll no longer tolerate and learning to protect the parts of you that still feel deeply.